Hi everyone! In today's video I'm going to be working on the miniature kitchen that's going into this miniature apartment in my 12 scale doll's house. So to begin, I'm making a floor plan. So I'm using some squared paper and I've measured out the full area where the kitchen can go. And of course, I'm being helped by my lovely little friend. She stayed with me whilst I was doing the floor plan, but when I started sanding and painting my miniature, of course she wasn't nearby because it's really important that she doesn't breathe in any of the dust or any of the paint fumes. So I began by cutting out the exact area that I had, and as you can see, the wall at the side of the doll's house wasn't actually at right angles to the back wall, so this was going to make it a little bit more difficult. Now, to turn my measurements 12th scale, I started by looking at how big a base unit for a kitchen would be in real life, and then I divided it by 12. Now, I've actually been planning a new kitchen myself for my real full-sized house, so I'm getting quite used to these measurements now, and the width of the base cabinets vary. So I've got some different widths there, and I actually also plan a miniature version of a 60cm unit a little bit later on as well. So my units are going to have plinths at the bottom like this, but the measurements above are for the base units without any plinth underneath. So once I had my measurements for the base units, I worked out the depth first because this was how far away from the wall the units were going to be. And I decided that I wanted my units to go along the back wall and also the side wall. They're going to sit underneath the mezzanine bedroom area. But I wasn't sure if I wanted a little bit of worktop here that could kind of make like a breakfast bar. So I cut my template out and then I popped it back into the doll's house to try and help me to decide whether I wanted that breakfast bar area or not. I decided to cut it away to see what it would look like if it wasn't there, and I also moved this piece of paper around the living area because I had to think about the fact that I wanted a settee, and if I had a settee it would be very close to the breakfast bar area. So I've made the decision to not have the breakfast bar. I'm just going to have the units running along the back wall and the side. First of all, I measured how much room I had on that back wall, and I had 190mm, so I was going to work out how many cabinets I could put there. But then I realised actually the distance was shorter than that for two reasons. So one was that I wanted to fit a fridge in the corner. Now I couldn't put it in this corner because the door wouldn't be able to open. And I didn't want to put it at this end because this is where you enter into the doll's house. And I thought that actually it would block the view of the worktop. So I'd rather have it here in between the base units and the little staircase bookcase that I've already made. So I had a look at the measurements of a fridge, and I'm thinking of doing a freestanding fridge, maybe in sort of a retro style. And I made sure that the width that I left had space for the fridge, so I needed to basically remove 50mm, which is this amount, from the side. Whilst thinking about the space for the fridge, I also thought about what else I needed to include in the kitchen. So I needed to make sure that there was space for a sink in one section of the worktops. I also wondered whether I wanted a little mini washing machine, but actually in the end I decided to not include a washing machine because I'm not going to have much space for cupboards really. I could maybe put an integrated washing machine in there, we'll see. If I do, it'll probably go here near the sink. So for the measurements for the sink, I worked out that I needed about 10cm if I wanted a big sink and the draining unit as well. That left a little area here where I thought maybe I would put some shelves down the side. So that would mean that I would have space for two 50mm cupboards in between the shelf and the corner unit. On this side, I measured how much space I had, and I worked out that I could put two units in that were just over 40mm each. So this would represent the size of a 50cm wide unit if it was in real size. And that would mean that I would just have to put something at the end to fill the little gap. So this was my plan. Next, I headed out to buy some glue. So if you've watched my previous videos, we've had lots of discussions about different types of glue, and I've been recommended Gorilla Glue by quite a few people, so thank you so much for your recommendations. I had a look at all the different types. There were so many different types, and I was thinking of getting this one. But then I noticed that there was some UHU glue as well. Now, I've always used UHU glue and I love how quickly it dries. It's just that I find it tricky to apply it really neatly. But I found this bottle, which I've never seen before, and it had different nozzles that looked like they would sort of accommodate different sizes or amounts of glue that you needed to add. I did notice the wood glue on the top shelf, which I think is the main one that's been recommended to me in comments. But the reason I decided not to get that one was actually because of the drying time. It talks about clamping your pieces of wood together for 30 minutes, and I like to work quite quickly and I don't have any clamps. So I did actually opt for the UHU glue. I wanted to see what it was like because I've really enjoyed using the UHU glue in the past. It was actually just the way that I was applying it that I was finding difficult. I thought I'd give this one a go and see if it made any difference having it in a different bottle. Thank you so much though for all of your recommendations, because I probably will add some more glues to my toolbox in the future, especially a wood glue and a fabric glue as well. So here I was using plywood to make the base of my kitchen units. So I started by cutting out an area that was exactly the same size and shape as the template. Now, thank you so much to everyone that's spoken to me about different ways that they try to stay safe whilst cutting out wood. Obviously, I always say please don't copy me, and that applies for this video as well, because I'm not an expert, I'm not a professional, and I don't know if I'm always doing things in the safest way possible. One thing that I do need to try and be able to work a little bit more safely probably is a clamp, so that I can use this ruler and hold this ruler in place with my hand whilst I have the wood clamped to the table, because basically I find that I slip whilst I'm using the ruler because I'm trying to hold the wood and the ruler at the same time. So that is something that I need to really invest in, but I can't really attach it to this table because it's my dining room table. So to try and protect my fingers, I do always try and keep them well out of the way, and I try to go quite slowly when I'm cutting, and I also try and cut away from the direction of myself so that if I do slip, hopefully I'll be going in a different direction. But as I say, please never copy my methods or techniques. Always consult a professional if you would like to learn how to use different tools. So next I did a little diagram because I thought this would help me to work out exactly which pieces of wood I needed to cut. So using my little template as a guide, I thought about where the cabinets would be going and where I needed to make side panels and what their measurements needed to be. I used to have a really lovely little sketchbook when I was doing my Tudor doll's house, where I did all of my measurements and I had all of my sketches and my ideas, and I cannot find it anywhere. I've searched and searched for it. It's probably, maybe it's at the bottom of a box of materials or something that I'd been using, but I wish I knew where it was because it was a really nice collection and sort of a lovely keepsake of all the different projects that I'd worked on in my Tudor doll's house, and I would have liked to have been able to use it for this doll's house too. So hopefully I'll find it one day. So I cut out all of my side panels and I sanded them, and then I decided to label them because I knew that I was going to be cutting out quite a few different pieces of wood and I didn't want them to get mixed up when it was time to start gluing everything together. For the piece of wood that was going to go at the back of the base cabinets that ran along the side of the doll's house, I worked out what the height needed to be by working out the height of each cabinet plus the height of the plinth. So the little plinth that would go underneath the cabinets that hides the feet, in real life is about 15 centimetres. So for 12 scale, that's I think about 12.3 millimetres, so I rounded it down to 12 millimetres, and I added it onto the height of the cabinets. Just to double check my measurements before I went any further, I placed this piece of wood into my doll's house to check the height, and it looked really tall. So I actually had this miniature sink that came with one of my doll's houses, and I decided to put this in place just to check the height, and it was exactly the same height, so it was okay, my measurements were correct. It's a lovely little sink actually. I'm tempted to try and remove the little top part and attach it to my own worktop. It's got a nice towel rail as well, but I don't know, I quite like the thought of making my own sink, but it's such a lovely little sink unit. Next I had to work out how big the piece to go at the back here needed to be. So it needed to be the same height again as the piece that I'd just cut out, and it needed to go all along the back of all of the cabinets that would run along the back wall and the corner section too. So this section here, but I needed to trim a little piece off the end. And this was because the panel that was going to go along the back of the cabinets on the side wall was a depth of about 2 millimetres. So this new back panel would sit against the one at the side, so it needed to be 2 millimetres shorter. Again, I popped a label on it because I didn't want to swap it with the other panel by accident. Next, it was time to start gluing the pieces together. So I wanted to glue the base, so the L-shaped piece of wood, to these panels that were going at the back. And to do this, I measured 12 millimetres from the bottom because that was the area where the plinths would be. And then I attached a piece of wood, and this piece of wood was just going to act like a little shelf to hold the L-shaped piece of wood in place, just to give it a little bit of something to rest on, rather than just relying on the glue. So I trimmed both pieces to size because a piece of wood was going on each of the back panels, and then it was time to use my new glue. So it looked as if it had different nozzles depending on how much glue you wanted to apply. Now I think that the little dot nozzle will be the one that I need to use. I read through all of the instructions. Obviously all glues come with different information and warnings, so always do read and follow all of the directions on the glues that you're using. Now I tried to twist this because I assumed that that's how you change the different nozzles, but when I tried to twist it, it wasn't moving around very easily and I felt a bit of resistance, and I didn't want to break the mechanism inside because then I wouldn't be able to use my glue. So I knew that it was this smallest nozzle that I wanted to use anyway, so I just decided to start using it, and I was really impressed actually because I managed to apply the glue so much more neatly than I've been able to before. And I also really liked how the bottle has a base so you can stand it up, because I was previously using a tube, I had to sort of prop it up in a jam jar, and yeah, this was so much easier to use, so I'm so glad that I've bought this glue. As I say, I might still invest in a wood glue as well and a fabric glue, but for now this one seems to suit what I'm using it for. Now unfortunately I don't own any right angle clamps, but they would have been really helpful for this job. To make sure that this was drying at the correct angle, I lined it up with the grid on my cutting board, just to make sure that it was at 90 degrees. And whilst it was drying, I worked on making the little miniature plinths to go along the bottom. And whilst everything was drying, I went and made myself a cup of tea. Quite often, I start working on the next part before everything's properly dry. So I thought if I make myself a cup of tea, it will just give the miniature kitchen a little bit of time to dry. Apologies about my stained worktop here. I have a wooden worktop and it has a stain. I need to sand it down and seal it, but As I mentioned earlier, I have been looking at new kitchens and I am actually going to be getting new cupboard doors and have been looking at a new worktop. But I would love your advice actually on worktops, not for miniature kitchens but for full-size kitchens, because as I've been looking at new worktops, there's wooden worktops, laminate worktops, compact laminate, quartz, there's all different types of worktops. And they all come with different properties, and I'm finding it really difficult to know which one to get. I would like one that doesn't stain easily and that's nice and durable. So any suggestions would be gratefully appreciated. Yeah, please share your thoughts on different types of worktops in the comments. Now, when I returned to working on this little project, I realised that my measurements were no longer correct. And this was because when I'd added the panel at the back, it had added 2mm of depth to the kitchen units. And this didn't fit anymore because of the door frame in the doll's house. So I had to really carefully remove 2mm from the end here. I then started to put the side panels in place. But I hadn't really taken into account the fact that I'd just changed the length of the unit, so these measurements actually were no longer correct. So I glued all of the side panels in place, making sure that they were standing at right angles. And it was only when they were all glued in place that I realised about my measurements. And I actually had to remove 2 of the panels, this one and also the middle one on the other side, because I realised that they were no longer sitting centrally. So I decided to remove the shelving area at both ends of the kitchen units, but this meant that the 2 kitchen cabinets weren't the same size, so I had to remove these sections and reposition them so that they were central. Next, it was time to start working on the cabinet doors. I'd decided that I wanted the doors to sit inside a little frame, so I decided to cut out a panel that was the correct shape and size to cover the cabinets, and then I would cut out the doors from this panel. Rather than measuring accurately, I just used my existing cabinets as a template. I was using balsa wood for this, and one of the reasons I was using balsa wood instead of plywood was because I wanted to be able to push little hinges into the wood, and I thought that plywood might be a little bit too strong for doing this. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So to make the frame, I just left a 3mm border all around the edges. And then to cut out the 2 doors, I just scored really lightly because I was using very light balsa wood and I didn't want it to split. So I repeatedly scored the wood really gently until the doors were cut out. I actually paused before cutting out the rest of the doors to work out where the hinges would go, because I thought whilst the doors were still in place, it would be helpful to make a little mark that's on the door frame and the doors to make sure that the hinges would be in line. I filed away the doors a little bit and sanded them down, just so that there would be a little bit of a gap around each door so that they could move freely, because I wanted them to be doors that could be opened and shut. I also rounded off the corners a little bit. And I repeated these steps for the doors for the units that would be going along the back wall. But my camera actually ran out of battery, so I did a little bit more work whilst it was charging, and basically I added these pieces of wood to the back of the doors and I glued them across both the door and the door frame. I wanted to make some hinges, and I was originally going to use these little sticks to make the hinges, and so I didn't feel like the balsa wood that I'd used for the doors was thick enough, which is why I'd added these blocks of wood at the back. However, I did then change my mind, and I remembered that I had this craft wire, so I decided to use this instead. Seeing as the blocks of wood were already in place, I decided to use the wire to make little hinges that went all the way through the block of wood. Now I'd used my pin drill to drill the little hole for this piece of wire. I'd used my thinnest pin drill piece, but I did find that this was still quite loose. I decided to put both hinges in place to see if they worked. So once they were fitted, I just needed to carefully detach the block of wood between the door frame and the door, so I just really gently sliced through it, and this meant that there was some movement on the door. I did accidentally break the door frame whilst I was doing this, so I did have to glue it back together. Now unfortunately the little block of wood then fell off, and I wondered if I could add the hinge without the block of wood and without the pin drill, so that it would fit a little bit more securely. So I tested it on a spare piece of balsa wood, and I could indeed just push the wire through the wood without using the pin drill, and this meant that I didn't need the blocks at the back of the doors either, because the wire was a lot thinner than the little sticks that I was going to use. So I decided to use this method instead. So I just pressed the hinges in place, and then I removed the blocks of wood that were at the back of the doors and the frames because these were no longer needed. Unfortunately, when I was working on the second set of doors, I actually caused a little bit of damage to the door. I damaged it when I removed the wooden block, but I also damaged it when I was pushing the wire in place. I tried replacing it with a different piece of wire in a slightly different position, but actually I found that the wood had kind of lost its strength, and it started to just split even more. So this meant that I had to make a whole new panel. Now when I was making the new panel, I was using balsa wood again, but it seemed very different from the first piece, and as you can see from the door on the left, when I cut it out it split really easily, and this meant that the door wasn't very neat at all. So I actually ended up making this for a third time, and this time I used plywood so that it was a little bit stronger. So I went through the same steps again, but this time I did use my pin drill again, because I couldn't push the wire through the plywood with it being that bit stronger. This is how everything was looking, and the doors were now opening and shutting. So I glued the panels in place. And whilst they were drying, I had a little think about the worktop. Now I wanted the worktop to be slightly bigger than the cabinets, so I made it out of 2 pieces of balsa wood. Now this was the thickest balsa wood that I had. I also decided to add an end panel here. It did mean that the space for my fridge would be a little bit smaller, but I just thought that it would make the end of the cabinets look that bit neater. I haven't attached the worktop yet because this isn't the finished worktop. I just wanted to see how it would look. But in the next video I plan on working on the worktop and the mini sink. I hadn't measured quite correctly because by adding that end panel it added another 2mm of depth, and I'd already cut out the worktop. So I decided to add this piece at the back to try and push it just 2mm away from the wall to try and make the worktop the correct size, although it still doesn't fit quite correctly. But as I say, I will be working on the worktop in the next video, so I will try and mend this in the next video. When everything was dry, I used some multi-purpose filler just to try and fill any gaps where I'd joined pieces of wood together, because I've always found that this just helps make the miniature look that little bit more neat. So I was just using multi-purpose filler here, following the instructions. Obviously all fillers will be different, so if you're doing anything similar, please do refer to the information on whatever filler it is that you buy. Now this was quite a big gap here, and it actually ended up splitting after I'd put the filler on. So you will notice throughout the video I refill it on quite a few occasions. When everything was dry, I sanded the fillet, but I also used this little file as well to try and sand down the edges that met at right angles. I had added some shelves, but I did end up removing one of them because it was stopping one of the doors from opening and shutting. And this was because the hinge was just a little bit further in than on the other door, and it meant that the back of the side of the door was kind of hitting the shelf as it opened. Now the paint that I was using was some primer for undercoat and also some paint that was actually previously used to paint some kitchen units, some real sized kitchen units. But the paint had actually dried around the seal of the primer, so it was really difficult to open. So I made sure that the doors were still opening and closing, and I left this to dry. Whilst this was drying, I went to work on some of my illustration work. So for anyone who doesn't know, I run a small art and greeting card business, and I do custom pet portraits. And I've been able to work on some really lovely pet portraits recently. I've also recently been creating a website. I'll pop the link in the description if you'd like to have a look. And on the website I sell my art prints, greeting cards and also the custom pet portrait, so hopefully it makes the process a little bit easier because you can upload your photos of your pet and order the pet portrait all in one go. I've been keeping a collection of mini versions of my pet portraits in a little sketchbook so that I can look back and remember all of the lovely pets that I've been drawing. So I spent some time updating my little sketchbook whilst my miniature kitchen was drying. When I returned to my miniature kitchen, it was dry, but unfortunately the doors didn't shut anymore. After giving them a sand down, they did now open and close again. And now it was time to add the final coat of paint, and I fully expected that after adding the final coat of paint, I probably wouldn't be able to open and shut the doors again. And I also added some more filler into this little gap here. Oh, before painting this, I forgot about this step. I thought maybe I needed to add some details to the door to make them into a shaker style. So I had these pieces of wood that are a little bit like coffee stirrers, and I thought maybe I could edge the doors with them. However, I quickly found that this wouldn't work because the extra piece of wood would push against the area that acts as a little frame around the doors, so it stopped the door from opening and closing. So for it to work, it would actually have to have a little gap going down the side like this, which I didn't think looked very good. I also considered putting a little pattern in the centre of the doors, but then I wasn't sure where the door handle would go if I had this design. So I'd found these tiny little split pins and I thought they would make absolutely perfect brass handles. They're much smaller than split pins that I've ever seen before, and I just thought that they were the perfect size. I really liked the colour of them, and this is what I decided I was going to use. So I want the handle to be about in that position there, but that means if I put it on the door with the pattern on it, it wouldn't be quite in the right place. So I decided that I just wouldn't add the pattern to the doors for now. Instead, I decided to add some detail to the end panel. So this is the panel that will be visible. I decided not to add any extra wood to the side that would be near the fridge because this would just make the gap for the fridge a little bit smaller, and I'd already added a side panel to that side, so I'd already reduced the space that I had for the fridge, so I thought I'd better not reduce that space anymore. I glued these pieces of wood in place and I left them to dry. And when they were dry, I decided to paint my little kitchen. Unfortunately, when I opened the paint, I found that it completely dried out. I did manage to peel a little bit of the dried paint away. I found it fascinating how it had dried in layers like this. But I did find that there was some paint underneath that layer that could still be used. Because the paint had separated and dried, it did mean that I couldn't mix the paint before applying it. And I think this made the paint a little bit thicker than it should have been. And unfortunately, on one of the doors, as I painted it, you could tell that it was a little bit too thick, and I think the paint didn't level out quite as it should. But that was because I couldn't mix it before painting it on. I'd forgotten to trim the end panel down before painting everything, but thankfully I did manage to trim it down without affecting any of the paint that I'd already applied. And I added a little section along the bottom just to neaten it off here. Looking back, I kind of feel like I should have left this panel unpainted, but I did paint it, so never mind. And when everything was dry, this is how it was looking. So you can really tell with this door here that the paint didn't apply nice and smoothly. It looked quite different from the rest of the doors. I did also need to give the doors a little bit of a sand to make sure that they would open and close correctly. And I sanded the little door as well, before deciding whether or not to paint it again. Whilst I was sanding, I did end up actually making the area that had a lot of filler on need filling again. But actually, by the end of all the sanding, I decided maybe I didn't want this kitchen to look as if it was a brand new kitchen, and actually it made the kitchen look as if it had been used. And I quite like the idea that my little miniature apartment will look like it's been really lived in. So I've decided to actually not give the kitchen another coat of paint. I'm hoping I've made the right decision. I could always go back to it at some point and paint it if I'm not happy with it. So I used my little pin drill to make a hole, and I popped the split pins through, and this made my miniature door handles. Even though the worktop wasn't finished, I placed it on top just to see how everything was looking. So I plan on having a little miniature sink in this area here, and a draining board, and then probably a microwave and a kettle over in the corner, and a little chopping board on this side. What do you think? Please let me know if you think it does need another coat of paint. I quite like it as it is, but I think as I put other things into the doll's house, I might find that I want to paint it to make it look as if it's completely finished. When I'd finished tidying up, I started to think about my next miniature project, which would be the worktop. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that I've been thinking about new worktops for my own kitchen, and I have some samples that I'd been looking at. So I wondered whether I could use these for my worktop. But I'm not sure if I'll be able to cut them very neatly. So one option is to try and use some of these samples and to sort of lay them over this wooden worktop that I've already made. Another option is to have a wooden worktop, but I do need to do something about the fact that it doesn't fit correctly. Or I could maybe try and cover this worktop and try and create a marble effect or a stone effect or quartz. I made a stone effect worktop for the oven area in my Tudor doll's house, so I could maybe do something similar. Please do let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll have a little read through them before I make a start on the worktop. But yeah, this is how it's looking at the moment. What do you think about the edge that looks like it still needs painting? Do you think I should give it another coat of paint, or do you think it looks alright as it is? If you've enjoyed this video, please do remember to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. Please do leave a comment because I read them all, and I hope that you have a really lovely day. See you next time, bye!